will begin flowing to communities all across our state. These significant resources will help Washington State fight back against the opioid epidemic that continues, even as we speak, that continues to rip holes through the very fabric of our communities and of families, overwhelm our public health resources, and inundate our foster care system with young innocent victims. Today we can share that 125 local governments unanimously joined our resolution against the 3 largest opioid distributors. We'll talk more details about those 125, but the settlement required them to join, and all 125 have now officially signed on. As a result, because every one of those jurisdictions have joined that resolution, Washington State will recover the full amount of the settlement that my team negotiated with these distributors. The result is more than $476 million will be directed toward addressing the opioid epidemic in Washington State. It's fitting, I think, that we finalize this case during National Recovery Month, because that's a lot of what this is about, is trying to get folks to recovery, and you'll hear more about that from our other speakers. So today, for the first time, we're releasing the total amount of resources that each Washington State jurisdiction will receive as a result of our successful lawsuit and litigation. We'll also provide an overview of the different strategies towards which local and state officials can and must direct these resources. In other words, these funds cannot simply go to the state general fund to be used for some other important purpose. No, these funds must be directed towards addressing the opioid epidemic that we're facing. I'm going to introduce a number of folks who are here today. I'm going to start with the individuals who really made this result happen. A number of folks from my office. There's been a large team over a number of years, and they're represented by a portion of that team here today. Complex Litigation Division Chief Jeff Rupert. Jeff is available also to help answer questions about this settlement, which is a large, complex document, so you may be hearing from him later on. Consumer Protection Division Chief Laura Clinton. A number of Assistant Attorneys General, Martha Rodriguez Lopez, Tad Robinson O'Neill, Susan Lorenz, Kelsey Andrus, John Gus, and Paralegal Morgan Mills. They represent a portion of the folks in my office who, again, when I said no to a national resolution that basically every other attorney joined in, that meant we faced a multi-month trial against these distributors who have a lot of resources to litigate cases. And it's because of the successful work of my team, taking them on, taking them to court, that we got a resolution that brings in tens of millions of dollars more for Washington State than we would have received had we joined the resolution that basically every other state had previously agreed to. I'm also proud to be standing with several speakers who you're going to hear from shortly, who will provide their unique perspective on the importance and the urgency of these additional resources to combat the opioid crisis. First, not speaking, but joining us from Burien is Mayor Sophia Aragon, who's joined us today. Thank you so much, Mayor, for being here. Speakers that you'll be hearing from after I speak, beginning with State Representative Tara Simmons, King County Council Member and King County Board of Health Member Gurmai Sahilai, Allison Heinzman, Tacoma firefighter and president of Local 31, Deputy Chief Paul Younger, Tacoma Police Department, and Dr. Crystal Shen, a board-certified pediatrician. They will briefly describe their personal perspective on this epidemic and their work in addressing it. At the conclusion, we're happy to take any questions that you might have. So before providing a bit more detail about the resolution, I think we all agree it's important to make one point up front, and that is, while $500 million is a lot of money, there is no amount of money that we could bring back from this litigation that would bring back the lives that have been lost because of the opioid epidemic in Washington State. And I think that's something that each of us feels acutely and still feels as we're facing it today. We, all of us, have spoken to and met with folks who lost loved ones and colleagues to the crisis. So while this money cannot do that, and no amount of money could do that, these funds will help prevent the next victim of the opioid epidemic, because we know that there are not enough resources for the work we need on prevention and treatment and so many other issues. The second point I want to make from a preliminary standpoint is we are certainly not done in the Office of the Attorney General to hold accountable those who we believe fueled the opioid epidemic illegally in pursuit of profits. So we go to trial next year against Johnson & Johnson, for example. So this is not our first case. It won't be our last. And while we do not speak publicly about investigations that we have or don't have, I think it's fair to say that this issue is a priority for me and my team, and I'm confident this won't be our last press conference where we're announcing a large resolution on behalf of the people of the state of Washington as we continue this work to fight back against those who we think fuel this epidemic in pursuit of profits. Third, I just want to mention that, and I touched on this briefly, there was a national settlement that basically every Attorney General signed on to with the distributors. And I rejected that settlement, which, candidly contained a healthy amount of risk, right, to turn down a large resolution. I rejected it for a number of reasons. One, I didn't think it was enough money, but also I had confidence in my team that we could take those distributors to trial and get a better outcome for Washingtonians, that we get more money back for the tremendous need that we have. And by rejecting this deal and a previous deal with the Sackler family and Purdue Pharmaceutical, by rejecting those deals and going to court against both entities, both of those cases, we've now returned about $160 million more back to Washington State than had I signed on to those deals like other AGs did. And that's why we're taking Johnson & Johnson trial as well. We're not doing a national deal. We're going our own way, and that's because I have a team that can litigate these cases and do an excellent job in getting additional recoveries on behalf of the state of Washington. So a few details before I turn it over to our speakers. I'm not going to go into the details of the case itself because that's been well covered. If you have questions, we're happy to take them, but we're going to focus on the resolution of this case. But as a reminder, at a very high level, the case was about the failure of these three corporations to stop suspicious opioid shipments coming into Washington State and their failure to report those suspicious orders to the Drug Enforcement Agency as they are required to under law. So in order to finalize this settlement that we reached after the close of evidence in our trial, multi-month trial here in King County Superior Court, two things need to happen to get the full amount. All 37 Washington local governments that filed their own lawsuits against these distributors, they had to join the resolution as well. And number two, all local governments that had not filed their own lawsuit but have a population of more than 10,000, they also need to sign on. This is a structure we've seen across the country. So that was a total of 88 jurisdictions that had not filed but were larger than 10,000. So we needed those two entities to sign on. If we'd fallen short of that, we either would have received a smaller amount of money than the maximum, or we would receive nothing at all. And thankfully, all 125 of those jurisdictions, as I mentioned, have signed on to this resolution. And that's our announcement today, that all 125 have signed on, which means Washington State is receiving the full recovery. I want to thank our local governments for standing shoulder to shoulder with us through this, during this crisis. $215 million of the recovery will go directly to cities and counties to be used to heal communities in crisis. Local governments in all 39 counties will receive a portion of the settlement. And Washington is giving one of the higher percentages of the funds directly to its cities and counties in the nation. The local governments, by the way, they negotiated for themselves how to divide the money. So that was their resolution amongst themselves for that $215 million, how to divide that up. They did agree on a formula based on how many opioids were shipped in their communities, how many people died as a result of opioids, and how many people are currently suffering from opioid use disorder. I believe we have handouts that Brianna has listing our calculations of what those totals will be for each jurisdiction. But to give you a sample of that information, the top 5 counties, including their local governments, will receive the following. So King County, again, the county, local jurisdictions will receive $56 million. Pierce County, approximately $26 million. Snohomish County, a little over $25 million. Spokane County, a little over $19 million. Clark County, nearly $15 million. An equal amount, $215 million, will go to the state of Washington. And additionally, I'm directing the entire $46 million reimbursement of my office's costs related to bringing and litigating this case. All of that money will go to the state of Washington as well. So in total, $261 million goes to the state of Washington. The legislature, of course, will decide ultimately how those funds are spent, but lawmakers, under the terms of the agreement, must use the funds to address the opioid epidemic. I might add that that $261 million, of course, will inevitably flow into local jurisdictions, right? That's the nature of the work that the state does, is those dollars go back into communities in the forms of grants and direct appropriations. The resources we paid out over a total of 17 years. The first payment comes to the state of Washington and to the jurisdictions on December 1st. The resolution front-loads these payments to get significant dollars flowing quickly. The first payment, again December 1st, is the largest. That will be a total of $55 million, $37 to the state, $18 million to local governments. The consent decree aligns with our state's opioid response plan, and spending decisions by state and local governments must be consistent with that plan. Local governments will need to report how they're spending the money. So we have transparency throughout this process so the public can see how's the money being spent. There's a reporting mechanism built into this. Just to give you an idea of how the funds can and must be used, the resources can be used to fund desperately needed prevention strategies, including improved and expanded treatment options, addressing the needs of pregnant women and their families, including those with babies with neonatal disorder, youth-focused outreach and prevention efforts, support for first responders, and other evidence-based programs and services that can save lives and preserve families. By the way, this work includes illegal fentanyl. Well, some of us are having conversations about that before this press conference, which, as you know and has been widely reported lately, is responsible for skyrocketing overdoses in Washington state. By the way, the resources we're recovering in our other opioid litigation, including Purdue Pharmaceutical and the Sackler family, that's also going to be directed toward the same strategies. So that's been our approach going into it. All the funds must go to addressing the epidemic. These resources are critical, and they will most certainly save lives. But you don't need to take it from me. I'm very proud to introduce our speakers, who I mentioned earlier, who will provide more detail. And again, the first speaker is someone who we've worked closely on these issues in her time in the state legislature, and that is State Representative Tara Simmons. Tara.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you so much, Bob. It is an incredible honor to stand here today in strong support of our Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, and the fantastic work he and his team have done on behalf of Washingtonians. I am honored to represent the wonderful people of the 23rd Legislative District in Olympia, and I'm grateful that over $7 million of this settlement will be appropriated to Kitsap County. But the opioid epidemic has impacted countless families all across Washington. I know this very personally, as the first formerly incarcerated legislator in our state, and a person who just celebrated 11 years of recovery from opioid use disorder 3 days ago. My serious and significant substance use disorder started with prescription opiates 14 years ago. At the time, I didn't think I was an addict because I was taking them as prescribed. However, as my doctor gave me more and more and my tolerance grew, eventually I used illegal drugs. That doctor ended up losing his medical license because I wasn't alone. However, the impact of my substance use disorder caused years of pain and destruction for myself and, more importantly, for my family and my children. It changed the trajectory of all of our lives, and the trauma is not easily undone. Not only did my children lose me to addiction, they then lost me to 2 years of incarceration, and they are still overcoming those traumatic experiences. However, what I also know is that recovery is possible. I am living proof of it. I am very proud of my 11 years of continued sobriety from all mind-altering substances, and to be part of a community that supports others on their road to recovery. This funding that A.G. Ferguson and his team have secured for the people and families of Washington will go a long way in preventing and combating substance use disorder at a time where fentanyl is taking the lives of so many of our loved ones. We must fully fund the continuum of care needs for people suffering with substance use disorder, and these resources are a great down payment, of which I will continue to advocate for as a state representative. We need to fund serious prevention programs, support our first responders with resources for diversion programs, and of course, both inpatient and outpatient treatment programs and aftercare needs. Today, I honor all of my colleagues who have come together to celebrate this milestone, and tomorrow we will come together to keep working until we have the resources needed to treat people with this disease. Thank you, Attorney General Ferguson, for including me in this special day. Thank you. And now I'm going to call up Gurmai.
This summer, the King County Council declared fentanyl overdoses a public health emergency. We did this because we saw death and despair skyrocketing from the widespread use and availability of this drug. In all of 2021, there were 385 overdoses, and that was an all-time record. 385 deaths. Through just 3/4 of this year, we've seen 427 fentanyl overdoses. We're eclipsing last year's number, unprecedented number, by hundreds and hundreds of more deaths this year. This is a crisis. And we always have to remember that these are not statistics. As the Attorney General mentioned, these are human lives. These are people overdosing. These are our neighbors. These are our family members. These are husbands and wives. These are children. King County Public Health is working tirelessly to address the overdose epidemic by working with partners to prevent overdoses, increasing access to evidence-based treatment, and providing harm reduction services. And this month, the King County Council will also consider legislation that I've been working on with a coalition of partners from around the region to build crisis care centers around the country. We need every strategy at our disposal to save as many lives as possible. The Attorney General's work to hold accountable the major corporations distributing opioids is integral to this. The hundreds of millions of dollars his team has secured from these distributors will flow through our state into local governments to support all of the strategies that I described above, from outreach to treatment, from case management to crisis care centers. I want to thank the Attorney General and his team for this incredible outcome. We look forward to continuing our work with you to address the opioid crisis. And before I leave, I just want to share with anyone watching, if you or a loved one are suffering from substance use disorders, effective treatment options, including medications to treat opioid use disorders, are available. You can call 1-866-789-1511. That's 1-866-789-1511, or visit warecoveryhelpline.org. That's warecoveryhelpline.org. Thank you so much. And next up, I want to introduce Allison Heinzman from Tacoma Fire.
Thank you so much for having me here today. We really appreciate that. As we've talked about, the opioid crisis is devastating our communities. It's tearing apart families. As first responders, we on the front lines see what's happening firsthand. We are going to an alarming rate of opioid overdoses in just the last year alone at increased potency due to the new batches and new forms that are coming out onto the streets. In a city where we often see fire and police underfunded, under-resourced, we cannot continue to maintain the strain that this crisis has placed on our community. Especially with everything else that we have going on. You guys, you saw the impacts that COVID had. You see the devastating impacts that come into hand with increasing medical cries that are coming out. This has truly impacted police and firefighters firsthand. We're sending more and more resources to these types of calls. Before, 2 years ago, we'd send a single unit for one patient and they'd get one dose of medications. Now, with the new batches that are coming out on the streets, we're sending 6, 7 resources out there. The single dose that used to bring a patient back to life is now taking 12 of those same doses just to revive that patient. We can't sustain this rate. We need help, and we need the support to do that. We cannot continue to battle this crisis alone. We need support from our city, from the government to be successful. We need those to support first responders and funding just like this. So again, thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. My name is Paul Younger, and I'm a deputy chief with the city of Tacoma. Let me be blunt. Fentanyl is a killer. This opioid settlement will help law enforcement agencies throughout the state battle this epidemic, and it's an honor to be here today to address you on behalf of all of them. But frankly, I wish I didn't have to. In Pierce County, opioid-related overdoses are the most common cause of accidental death, outnumbering motor vehicle collisions and firearms deaths. Fentanyl is now the main form of opioid illegally sold, and the problem is only growing. Pierce County's medical examiner recorded nearly 4 times as many fentanyl-related deaths last year as it did just 2 years earlier. Looking at the first half of this year, we see another increase by 80%. This is serious, literally deadly serious. To those of you who think this only affects illegal drug users, you're wrong. Between January of 2020 and June of 2022, at least 60 youths and young adults died from fentanyl in Pierce County. This included 4 school-aged children, kids under the age of 18, who died from fentanyl-related poisoning in the first half of this year alone. And it would have been a 5th if our own officer, Officer Ford, had not helped save a 2-year-old child's life just 2 months ago. And now we're seeing fentanyl in bright colors, targeting children, start to show up on our streets. This settlement will help agencies like mine battle this growing epidemic. And how can we stop things like this from happening? It starts with resources. And that's why I'm grateful to be here with the Attorney General with his support. But it also starts with all of us. I'll ask all community members, not just in Tacoma, but throughout our state, to help us. Pick up the phone and report tips. If you have information that we as law enforcement can help curb this epidemic, please help us by reporting what you see. And I'll leave you with this. The Tacoma Police Department is committed to fighting this epidemic and increasing the safety of our community. If you have an addiction to fentanyl, we encourage you to get the services you need. And if you're selling fentanyl, the fentanyl that is wreaking havoc in our community and killing our youth, we're looking for you, and we won't stop until that poison is off the streets. Thank you for your time. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Shin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Crystal Shen. I'm a pediatrician, and I'm with the Washington chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And we've heard so much useful information from people in terms of how alarming the opioid epidemic is. And I wanted to speak a little bit from a physician's perspective. I found it quite alarming over the past years as the rise in opioid-related overdose deaths has increased, especially in youth, especially in teens, like 14 to 18 and beyond, and we've seen it even in younger kids. And it's been particularly concerning since so much of this has been linked to fentanyl, which can be so lethal and very accessible in different ways. There are effective treatments that exist, including medications that can help patients suffering from opioid disorder access recovery. However, right now demand extremely outstrips capacity. I've heard about teens. There's a 16-year-old patient who was hospitalized for different injuries from an accident, found out to be suffering from opioid use disorder, including fentanyl. Then he and the parent had dramatically wanted to access services to help get off of this. However, they tried accessing services and couldn't. They actually had insurance, and they were looking for any inpatient rehabilitation options, and they were looking out of state because they couldn't find anything locally, and they were a month-long waiting list. They actually looked for an outpatient service too, but they would have to get special permission to access this because they are a younger teen. So there just weren't effective resources, and even being put on that waiting list, it'd be months and months before they could access care. So we've seen firsthand how there are effective treatments that exist. The science and the knowledge is there, but we really need to ramp up capacity to really help people access care where they can and decrease barriers to this. So having more options like drop-in care, more places where people can access care is incredibly effective and remarkable. I've worked with families and youth, including babies who've been born to pregnant moms with opioid use disorder, and I can see firsthand how having adequate support and resources is so necessary. And I'm extremely excited that these resources that are flowing in will possibly help with this. Thank you.
Thanks to all of our speakers who I think gave you a sense of the breadth of the challenge, but also the incredible work they're all doing to really address the epidemic that we're facing. Just a quick final thought before we open your questions. When I traveled the state, I went around to speak to every Rotary Club in the state, and I would almost always talk about these cases that we had. And I would hear almost always two things would happen. One is that at the end of my talk, when people were kind of wrapping up, somebody would walk up to me afterwards and kind of pull me aside a little bit and say, "Hey, Bob, can I share something with you?" And I would know exactly what they were going to say. They would say, "Hey, I have a child who's suffering from opioid addiction, or I lost a loved one, or I have a colleague, or I myself have suffered from this in the past." And it gave me a sense of, well, I knew the numbers, and we've shared some of those numbers with you today, but the sense of the scale on a personal side in every corner of our state. Look, opioid addiction does not care if you're a red county, a blue county, urban, rural, east of the mountains, west of the mountains. It's indiscriminate. And that came through. Number two, what I heard repeatedly is we need more resources to help address the epidemic. And that's what today's announcement is all about. There's so much more work to be done. I'm so grateful to all the speakers who you heard from who are doing that work, and many others, individuals all across our state. And it's certainly my hope and the hope of my team that this nearly $500 million that's coming to our state and to our communities will help save lives. With that, we're going to stop and open up any questions that folks may have.
Bob, this settlement involves what distributors?
The distributors were 3 distributors we took to trial. These are all Fortune 20 cases: AmerisourceBergen, Cardinal Health, and Jeff, remind me? McKesson, of course, yeah. So these are all Fortune 20 companies. There was a multi-month trial right here at King County Superior Court. The settlement was reached at the conclusion of the evidence, basically, before the verdict is when the resolution was reached. So those 3 distributors reached a national resolution with, I think, literally every other Attorney General, and we took them to trial.
And then J&J is...
Johnson & Johnson is, trial dates can move, right? But we anticipate going to trial against them next year. And that, again, will be right here. And so that's just Washington State. That's just my office taking them to trial. And we anticipate that going to trial next year. You bet. Thank you.
And these were settled before a judge reached a decision?
I think the question was, these were settled before the judge reached a decision. That is correct. So the trial was months long. The evidence concluded. And then there's a period there, which is not unusual. You see on big cases sometimes a negotiation that goes on after both parties have essentially closed their case and before the judge issues a decision. So that is correct. This resolution was reached, and that was now some months ago. But of course, then we had to go through the process of reaching out to every local government, like Bury and others, to see if they would agree to it. The part of the understanding in the settlement was we had to get them all on board with it, and that's what we've been working on the past few months. And we just, in the last few days, got all 125 to sign on.
Why did you not want to continue going and see if you could get more from a judge?
So why did I not want to keep going and get a decision from the judge? Well, I guess what I would say is I wanted to. We wouldn't have gone to trial if I didn't want that. But, as Attorney General, I have to balance out the risks with what we might achieve from a judge's decision. And it's a pretty high stakes case, to put it mildly. And for me, it just wasn't really an option. And there's always some risk, right? The other side has sophisticated attorneys, and it's a hard-fought case. But there was obviously some risk in waiting for a verdict. And it seemed to me that reaching a resolution at that point that brought in significantly more resources for Washington had we accepted the original deal that every other state took. I don't want to suggest it was easy, right? But that seemed like, in balancing a lot of factors, that seemed like the right decision. And I'm someone who's, I don't mind taking a fair amount of calculated risk, I think, in my job. But there is a time, I think, in any negotiation, any trial, any case, anything in life, that you have to balance that out. And so that's why I reached the decision I did. Not easy. I'll be candid, right? Not easy. We spent a lot of time talking about it, but we feel it's the right one. Yes.
I know a lot of police departments around the state are down. Yeah. A lot of officers. You said that this money can be used to hire first responders. I mean, does that include? Can they just take this money and hire officers, or would it need to be like sort of like a specific subset of officers, people who are dealing or trained?
Right. So Jeff, I know that so this is Jeff Rupert, by the way, who helped negotiate this deal. I know we've talked about this. I just want to make sure I get it right, and then you can add about that issue specifically.
Sure, yes. First of all, the settlement can be used to hire first responders, to answer your question directly. It's supposed to be focused on opioid remediation, but I think the chief would tell you here that the officers, how do you separate that part of the job? So it's going to be for each local government to decide, but they've got the ability to do that if they want to.
And we think that's important. First responders, law enforcement, they see it on the ground. That's one thing I've heard from all across the state, whether you're a big jurisdiction or a small jurisdiction, these challenges are real for every community. And so that made sense to put into the agreement. And we trust local governments, obviously, to use those resources, as you heard from those folks, in a way that makes sense to grapple with the epidemic. Any other questions for us?
Was there difficulty getting all the counties on board?
Was there difficulty getting all the counties and cities on board? Was there difficulty? I would say looking at 125 jurisdictions to agree on anything these days is not easy, right? But I think it goes to how pervasive this crisis is, that 125 very different jurisdictions, size, politics, you name it, right? I mean, very different jurisdictions that all 125 agreed to this resolution, some of which were litigating their own cases, to be clear, right? There was different litigation. So I guess I wouldn't go as far as say that I was surprised or that it was overly difficult, because I think that jurisdictions and the elected officials, right, representing individuals, they understand the crisis. I mean, you've heard from some folks here today. I think it was one of those, sometimes we have a case where you have to sort of explain what we're going on and why we're doing it. This was not really one of those cases. They understood. Now, that said, to get 125 jurisdictions that might have different ideas about, should we go to trial? Is this enough money for us? Should we get more? What are what we have limitations on how we spend it? Do we agree with that? Not necessarily easy, but I'm very proud that my team worked hard. We had a lot of communication, answered all their questions, and I'm really pleased that we reached it in our timeline that we did. You bet.
Could we hear from the Mayor Burien, just any ideas about how you might spend the money? I think if I saw correctly, like $58,000 about that you're getting from this. Do you have ideas how you'd like to spend it?
Well, I think what's important for smaller jurisdictions like Burien is to think about partnering with each other. For example, the South King County cities, of which Burien is a part of, we have very similar challenges when it comes to the opioid epidemic and approaching it. So I think that's a large opportunity there. And the other piece for me, I just think it's really important to span prevention as well as treatment. And so in Burien, for example, we do a lot of work with youth and violence prevention, so I see a good connection there. And when I go home, I'll seek out some opportunities with my council to see if this funding can help.
And Gene, just one thing to add to that, I think that the mayor really spoke to this. So obviously some jurisdictions like large counties receive many, many millions of dollars. Some smaller, relatively speaking, smaller cities don't receive nearly as much. But jurisdictions like Burien have a lot of options to actually put their funds into a regional pot to pool their resources together. Obviously, opioid addiction doesn't care about separating a jurisdiction boundary of Burien with an adjacent city. So there are tools in there in the settlement where those jurisdictions can pool with other jurisdictions nearby, or even regionally with the county, to pool those resources together. Thanks for asking that.
Bob, talking about this issue is massive. How much is this money going to actually help, and do we need more money to get out of this?
Yeah, and I'll invite other speakers who may want to add to this. So I guess you're asking, hey, how much will this mean and how much more do we need? I guess taking the latter question first is we need more, a lot more. The need is, it's big. The scale is hard to wrap your arms around. It's hard to wrap around for an individual who may have gone through, right, individual challenge. It's hard to wrap around for a community or a state, which is why we're still pressing forward cases and may have future announcements about additional cases later on. So the scale is that big, right? So that said, look, $500 million is $500 million. It's the way that I look at it, and I'll leave it to my colleagues to add, is, look, one thing that helped me decide to settle the case, kind of the question earlier was, I was certain that this settlement would save lives and would prevent some folks from ever going down the path of addiction. I was very, very sure of that. And that is something important. And so I think for me, in my calculation, that's kind of how I thought about it, but really we'll welcome other speakers to add to those questions. Anybody want to add to that? Go, Deputy Chief, do you want to add? Go ahead.
Thank you. And I think the question was how much additional resources or funding would be needing to fight this pandemic or epidemic. And the answer is, how much is the value of a human life? The jail system and the prison system shouldn't be the biggest or the largest treatment facility there is, not for opioid addiction, not for mental health, and not for homelessness. So you can't put a dollar amount on how much public safety costs.
Anybody else? Thanks. Any other questions folks have? So just to wrap up, we'll be available, speakers will be available afterwards to take any questions you have. Brianna's reminding me, I think we might have some folks on the line, which I did not ask. If anyone on the line wants to ask a question, So I think we have some folks from radio station.
Yes, hi, this is Hannah Scott. with
Yes,
Fire
Hannah.
Radio.
Yeah, go right ahead. I think we can hear you.
How about you and what's the percentage for everybody else that want to how these dollars might be to both address a permanent fix to the Blake decision as well as the implementation of the 988 system?
Thanks, Hannah.
Yeah, thank you. So this is Representative Simmons, and I think that some of this funding will be used to fund, first responders and diversion programs. Right now we have, through the Blake Fix, we did for 2 years, set up a substance use disorder navigator system. It's just coming online, and it needs more. We need to have warm handoffs in the community so a police officer can connect an individual suffering with opioid use disorder immediately to somebody potentially with lived experience who can help walk them through the path to recovery and get them into services. So I think that is a really strategic place that some of this funding can go to.
Thanks, Hannah. Any other questions from folks on the line? If not, I will be available for questions here. And just a final word I do want to add is I've mentioned my team a couple times, but there's big cases and then there's cases on a whole nother scale. And this is certainly in that latter category. Look, if you take on one Fortune 20 corporation, you can expect a pretty challenging litigation. They have a lot of resources to hire the biggest law firms. You take on 3 of them for a trial, that's going to go on for years, and the trial itself for months. That's asking a lot, right, for a supervisor to ask a team to do that. And so we wouldn't be here today if a lot of things hadn't happened, but it is certainly the case that we would not be here today if my team had not stuck with this case from when they filed it, through all the challenges of litigation, the trial itself, and months of trial. It was extremely hard work, and Washington State and the people of Washington State are the beneficiaries of their hard work to bring back those additional dollars that, frankly, other states aren't going to receive. And so I want to thank them one last time. Thanks all for being here, and we're available for more questions afterwards. Thanks so much, everybody. Hey, thanks, you guys. Great job, you guys. Great job.